Hello again, everyone, and welcome to a new series where I go through my various bookshelves and go through my book collection, one shelf or one genre at a time. And I figured the easiest place to start would probably be with my various books on motion pictures, motion picture history, filmmaking, etc. Various books of film criticism, and then, of course, various biographies about actors, actresses, directors, producers, professionals, etc. Since it's really a field that I don't think gets covered very much, and of course, most review channels and things out there really very rarely, if ever, look into the print world, which is where all the real fun stuff is. So, anyway, I figured I'd start with my bookshelf of various books about film criticism, film theory, filmmaking, etc. These are primary books I picked up secondhand at used bookshops, eBay, okay, not really Amazon Marketplace, but just kind of all over the place, but primarily eBay and used bookshops. So usually I'm just trying to find things that I haven't read or things that hopefully have new information in them. But then again, if books are free or less than $1 or sometimes 50 cents or less, then I have a hard time not taking them with me. But anyway, so this would just be going through my various books that are on film criticism, film history, film theory, and filmmaking. So without further ado, let's go to the shelves. All right, first up is a couple books on cinematography. And interestingly, there's not a whole lot of really great cinematography reference books out there. I mean, there's a lot more now with digital photography, but they're usually more focused on the programs and not on the the art itself of cinematography. However, there are a couple books that I think are important. Unfortunately, of course, I'm not able to afford every book I want. But one of the big ones that I think everybody should at least know of if you don't know about it already. This is now, quite a number of years old, but I think it was originally written in 1965. But this is the classic Five C's of cinematography. This is one of the old touchstones of just the art of learning how to photograph motion pictures. It's very straightforward, very easy to read. Not particularly long, but it's nicely sized and a larger trade edition, so you can actually get some really good printings of technique and actually what the book is trying to tell you. So you get figures and diagrams, and then some really nice specific examples. And I really like the printing on this because it's actually very easy to see what's being talked about. So this is an easy no-brainer. If you're at all wanting to learn about cinematography, this is one of the easy go-tos. It's pretty cheap nowadays because pretty much everybody's used it. It's been used in various courses and classrooms, so you can pick up a copy for a couple bucks. Now, this one is very similar. It's used in a lot of courses and stuff, and I picked it up at some point. Sometimes when you pick up reference books like this, you just put them on the shelf, and they're nice to pull out every once in a while and look through. And they're not worth a whole lot, so it's not really wise to get rid of them. But anyway, this was, I think, originally written in the 80s, but this is the bare bones camera course for film and video. It's pretty much printed in a sort of mocked script style on the cover. It's a very cheap, very little handy guide about basic cinematography. Some of the same stuff that's in 5Cs. So again, this has been used in a lot of classrooms, and so you can get a copy for super cheap. But again, it's a lot of the same stuff with basic diagrams and things like that. So nice once you pick some of these up to just keep them on hand. Now, if you want something much more in the way of actually getting into the history of things, this also is used in a number of classroom scenarios. And I think this is a third edition, so I'm sure there's probably a later one. I think this was originally written in the 70s and 80s. But this is Chris Malkowitz's third edition of cinematography. And again, pretty much more of a textbook with a lot of history in here. But this is a really nice, basic book. Talks about everything from how to use a light meter to overall history of both motion picture photography and lighting. So it's a nice little reference book to have on hand. And then lastly, this is another book I picked up years and years and years ago. This one I think is a really good little little overview about cinematography. This is Roy Thompson's Grammar of the Shot. Again, I picked this up years and years ago. It's from Focal Press, and it's basically yet another manual with a lot of diagrams. But it's really well laid out. It's nice and almost pocket sized, and you can always carry this little guy with you. So again, a lot of the same stuff, but it's very concise, very well written, very straightforward. This is all really nice, beginner to intermediate material. And then getting on to more again textbook style stuff. This is just a great overview book. Again, this has been used in a lot of classrooms. It's gone through multiple editions, so you can usually pick up an older book, an older edition if you want to, for literally a few bucks. But this is David Cook's classic History of Narrative Film. This is the old 4th edition, which I think is from the early 2000s. As you can see, it's very, very thick. This is a full-on textbook, but this makes excellent reading for even those who are not trying to be professionals or professional film scholars or critics, but just in general, if you want a better overall overview of the history of motion pictures, this is a great place to start. It's the text is actually pretty. It's pretty nicely spaced, so it's not like just diving into a giant reference book, but it certainly has plenty of material to be considered a reference book. As I said, this is a frequently used textbook in college courses, but it still holds up remarkably well. The writing style is very easy to understand, never really talks down to the reader. So I think this is a really, really great place to start if you just want to know more overall about not just various cinema of various countries and international cinema, but just a good overall history lesson, and tries to get as much as it can into one particular volume. And then, of course, here we have another classic that's been republished and has come in many, many, many editions. This is one of the books that really, now that you have the internet, a lot of this stuff's become more null and void because everybody can look up a particular item with, the click of a finger on their phone even. But anyway, this has long been a standard reference book, but this is David Thompson's Biographical Dictionary of Film. This is the 3rd edition. I think they're up to at least edition 4 or 5 now. But this is literally just a gigantic encyclopedia listing of various professionals, actors, actresses, directors, cinematographers, with a nice biography write-up on each. And this is really what got David Thompson much more notable. And he's written, many, many biographies and other film theory books and et cetera throughout the past few decades. But this is really what he's probably most famous for. And it still holds up pretty well. It's nice to have something to thumb through and, reread or refamiliarize yourself with somebody's work, just and on a quick reference basis. So once you get a copy of books like this, and they're so thick and they get replaced by later editions, they aren't really worth a whole lot on the used market. So you can pick up books like this sometimes for $1 or $2 in a used bookshop. So I saw a nice condition copy of this edition and figured, why not? All right, so this next one, it's again kind of much more. There is some good information in here, but a lot of this stuff you can find online nowadays. But anyway, this I picked up primarily because of the author. So this is a Miramax book. This is it's called Boffo, but it's essentially about stories of box office success, primarily in cases where it was really against the odds. But it's about each chapter is about a various film or television show and how it challenged the industry expectations to become successful. I picked this up because it's written by Peter Bart, who was a really, really important figure in the New Hollywood period. He worked. He was very high up at Paramount Pictures. He wound up also being very high up in the tumultuous days at MGM and the Kerkorian years throughout the 70s and 80s, and then took over as editor-in-chief at Variety for many, many years. So one of the best and most experienced of industry writers. But anyway, it's fun to read through once or twice. There is a really nice section about certain films and things, but again, with a lot of this stuff, you're able to find out much more than you were in, say, the early 2000s about the more juicy stuff. So it's an okay read. I just picked it up because I'll read anything Peter Bart writes. And the same The same can be said for this next book, which is also, well, this is co authored by Peter Bart, but it's also by Peter Guber. And this was a tie in to their unfortunately short lived AMC series, used to run weekend mornings called Sunday Morning Shootout, where they would talk to various industry professionals. And it was very much a industry driven chat show. So it was great for, people like me. But anyway, so this is simply titled Shootout, and it's various tales of, ups and downs in the industry. And again, a lot of this stuff can be found out online now. But I picked this up because, I grew up watching that show when it actually aired. It was not the greatest thing in the world, but at least it felt much more upfront and honest because these were industry people talking about the industry itself over coffee on Sundays. Now it would just be posted on a YouTube channel or something. But anyway, this was just a nice throwback to watching that show when I was growing up. So now we're getting into more of the film theory stuff. This book is entitled I Do and I Don't, A History of Marriage in the Movies by Janine Basinger, who is a really, really great film historian and writer. She's written a lot of work on Frank Capra and other directors, but also has done work for the Frank Capra collection, and then, of course, the It's a Wonderful Life commentary on the Criterion Laserdisc. So there's some names, if I see on a book jacket, I'm gonna read it. And I've read so many books in libraries, and anything in the motion picture section I devour, and then quickly realize if it's any good or just terrible or yet another regurgitation of generic facts. But this is a pretty good book. I've read it a number of years ago, but again, I found a copy super cheap in a secondhand bookshop, so figured I'd reread this. And that she's one of the names that if you see it on a book jacket, it's at least gonna be worth your while. And I thought the idea of actually looking at the concept of how marriage is shown throughout the history of motion pictures and how it's used in story elements was an interesting idea, not just another of the exact same book you've already read. So, keeping on with going alphabetically by author, this is a really interesting book that I wish was better known. But this is a book by John Belton entitled Widescreen Cinema. This is basically about the birth and development of all the various widescreen processes, primarily in the 1950s and 1960s, with, of course, the adoption of CinemaScope by Fox, and then the various large format widescreen systems for everything from VistaVision and Technorama to, of course, Cinerama being the most impressive of the primary systems with its three panel setup, and running up through the 1970s with 70 millimeter blowups and other developments like Dimension 150, things like that. And it talks a little bit also about the various stereo soundtrack forms and magnetic stereo tracks that were on various widescreen processes. So it's a really nice overview book. See, it's also got some pretty nice diagrams, and it talks about the various studios and how they adopted each process, and then, of course, how each process was eventually tweaked in things. So here's a really nice diagram, and this book is loaded with them. It's also really nice that it's a little bit whiter. So, of course, it's kind of a gag. The cover's a little bit of a wraparound. I don't know if you can see that. But on some of the diagrams, it helps because it gives you an ability to actually use more of the page margins to reproduce what the full width of the image is supposed to be showing. So you can see a lot of these mock-ups would really, back in the day, try and show theater owners that hey, you need to go really, really, really wide because it could look like this, even though it's not really physically possible to look like that. But anyway, this is a really, really great overview of widescreen processes and the adoption of widescreen throughout the industry. And I think it's a really important, subsect of film history that's just not really well known about whatsoever. Most people either, they might know about scope, and a little bit of the history of scope, and then they, of course, probably know a little bit about 70 millimeter, and that's about it. Not even the importance of 6-track magnetic audio for 70 millimeter being the big draw for many, many decades. So anyway, a really nice book about, a certain subject I'm really, really passionate about. And, thankfully, stuff like this keeps things from being lost to time. Now, this next book, again, one of the names you see on a jacket is I'm immediately going to pick it up. And unfortunately, we just recently uh, Rudy Belmer passed away, so this was a really nice find. This is entitled America's Favorite Movies Behind the Scenes. So it basically kind of jumps around to various on-set and behind-the-scenes information, anecdotes, things like that. And Rudy Belmer really kind of, in a lot of ways, kind of helped to popularize this notion or make it more acceptable to do. His original books, his most famous first work is probably Memo from David O. Selznick, where he went through just the years and years and years and years of voluminous Selznick memos and condensed them all into one massive book to really give you an insight into the inner workings of Selznick's mind. But anyway, so anytime he wrote a book, it's exceptionally well written, well researched, and definitely worth your time. So yeah, this was just another book I was not really aware of, but I've read through it, and it's a really great read, just like with all his books. So again, if you see Rudy Belmer's name on any book jacket, it's definitely worth your time. Now, here we have one of the super well-known, super important, everybody should read it books, and it's also a heck of a lot of fun to read. But this is Peter Biskin's Easy Riders and Raging Bulls, which, again, pretty much everybody knows about this book by now, and if you haven't, you should definitely go and read it. This is basically all about the emergence of the New Hollywood movement and focuses on all the individuals, or I should say the most notable and famous or out there individuals of the next generation that was coming up through the death of the studio system in the mid to late 1960s. And what's great about this is it also, Biskin went out and did tons and tons of interviews and also pieces together how their careers rose or got stagnant or fell and came back. And it also talks about their various failures once they became successful, which is always really interesting. What's great about this book is that it tries to be much more upfront and honest, but it's also sort of got a exploitation vibe to it, because as you can see by the subtitle, it's how the sex and drugs and rock and roll generation saved Hollywood. So some people have accused this book of being a little bit more on the, hey, let's just try and be salacious and act like everybody were crazy rock stars and just go into parties all the time and stuff. But it's a good read. It gives you an overview of the where everybody was and how their kind of personalities worked with one another, and really more of an insight into that particular time in the industry and how the studio system was completely on its last leg and dying. So again, everything in here you might want to take with a little tiny grain of salt, but it's still a great read, really fun, and tries to get more into the nitty gritty of all these people instead of the usual standard corporate bios that we're inundated with. Then a little while later, Biskin did the same thing about basically the independent film movement and the birth and rise of it through the late 80s, early to mid 90s, and that's Down and Dirty Pictures, which focuses primarily on Miramax and everybody in the Miramax orbit. But actually, in a lot of ways, I think this book may be actually slightly better than Easy Riders. It's got the same sort of vibe. It tries to be a bit out there and a bit, on the fun side instead of the super critical side. But I just think the facts are presented here a little bit better. It's probably easier too, because this was much closer to the actual time period, and I'm sure there were a lot more people to actually interview. Who were still with us, because it wasn't 20, 30 years later. But anyway, it's a really great, fascinating read, really gets behind the scenes and a lot of stuff, helps make the rise and eventual corporatization of independent films become much more easy to understand. I just wish it was as well read as Easy Riders Raging Bulls, because it's just as important in a lot of ways, and in some ways more important, because this stuff is just not talked about in the way that the New Hollywood period is. And then Biskin wrote this other book, which is basically just a grab bag of, film pieces, culture pieces. He's also written for various news publications and magazines and such. So this is Gods and Monsters. Essentially, again, more of a grab bag of some interesting pieces. So if you've read the other two books, you might as well read this one. And all three are super, super cheap on the used market. So I finally found a used copy. I'd read it in a library years ago. So, a fun little read, I guess. Now, this one was just a complete random. I saw it in a used bookshop, and the cover looked great. And pretty much, film books really took off in the 1970s once you had the adaptation of auteur theory, and then the main film critics like Andrew Sayers, Pauline Kael, so on and so forth, really giving the idea of film criticism and film theory and film history much more of a critical cachet or academic cachet. So there are some really interesting, more obscure film books from the 60s and 70s into the 80s that actually have some good information in them, some nice stills and things. So, if I see books like this for super cheap, I just pick them up because a lot of them have never been reprinted. So, it'd be like, at the worst, it's bathroom reading. So, anyway, this is by Joseph Boggs. This is The Art of Watching Films. So, again, the title is a bit grabbing, and so is the screen grab. Well, actually, this is actually more of like it's a screen grab from North by Northwest, and then the mock up with the audience heads. So, again, pretty much just a straight ahead book about film theory and audience participation, and not a bad read, but it does have some interesting points, and again some rather nice stills. Let me show you. Of course, here's a shot of the Bates house from Psycho. So again, sometimes you can just pick these up for a buck or less, and just at least have a nice book with a few couple interesting ideas you might not have thought about before, or maybe find a few anecdotes and have some nice stills. So this book was actually I got it as a gift many many years ago. It's basically just a book about reviews and reflections on the cultural impact of certain titles in particular. But it's well written, and I've read it a couple times now. It's just been on my shelf. It was one of the first film books that I really was uh, gifted, because at least people figured out what kind of books I like to read pretty quick. But anyway, it's not a bad little book. So this is The Movies That Changed Us. This is by Nick Clooney, who of course is probably most famous now for being George's dad, but he worked in believe local news for and various news outlets for a long while, and did a lot of film criticism. So this is a nice little book. Again, what's really great is that he talks about cultural impact of these titles, not just that these certain titles are great and should be remembered, but again, the cultural impact section is really the best part. So just a nice book of reflections. Again, kind of more of one of these sort of grab bag type of books. And this is another book by a pretty well known critic these days. Really more of a collection of various pieces, but under a central theme. And I quite enjoyed it, I have to say. But it's got one of those attention grabbing titles. So this is David Denby's Do the Movies Have a Future? So again, this is a collection of various pieces written for different outlets, and then a few new ones thrown in there. So it's a nice, simple, straightforward read, and thankfully it's not as completely pessimistic as the title would indicate. But again, not a bad read. And anytime you can find actual intelligent film criticism these days, or any example of film journalism that's actual journalism, it's really nice and refreshing. So next up is a book that was a tie-in to a series of documentaries about directors, but this is basically some extended interviews with individual directors broken up by chapter. This is the second volume. I've never really seen the first one around. I think I may have read it years ago, but anyway, this is the director's take two. Again, just basically various interviews with different directors. And the reason why I picked this up is there's a chapter with Billy Friedkin, among many, many others. And sometimes, even if you're just reading, things from directors you're not really into or know a whole lot about. You can find out interesting information, or challenge yourself or open yourself to new ideas, things like that. And anything you can read about various real life experiences can always help you later on in terms of knowing that other people went through the same thing. So an interesting little book, again, just a compilation of director interviews. Now, this one is a real big one. This one's fantastic. This is a book by Otto Friedrich, who's written several books about Hollywood history, but this was the real big one, and one that I can't recommend highly enough. So this is City of Nets, which is essentially about Hollywood in the 1940s. But it gets into details about the various studio inner workings, gives tons of basically miniature biographies about not just famous personalities like actors and actresses, but various composers, various refugees from Europe, because, of course, the mass influx of refugees trying to escape the Nazis, and how they all came to America, and in the arts they all wound up primarily in California and Hollywood, which is why we had this giant influx of talent all of a sudden. But anyway, there's fantastic, rich detail all throughout this book. It's one of those you can't put it down, and you can't possibly soak up everything that's in it in one read. So it really requires several rereads, really. I do really want to get his other books, but this is just an essential book about Hollywood history in general. So very, very highly recommended. This one is also very highly recommended. A lot of people know it. It's been a bestseller. It's been used as part of class courseworks and stuff, but it never really gets old. This is William Goldman's classic Adventures in the Screen Trade, which is all personal remembrances about being a super famous Hollywood screenwriter slash eventual script doctor and various other things. So it's basically a mixture of how to survive the industry and a personal memoir, and all with tongue firmly in cheek, very much in the tone of you can't possibly make this stupid crap up, and this literally happened. So it's a really fascinating, warm, lively read that again. It's really nice to have on the shelf and just, flip through every once in a while to remind yourself that there's always been craziness in the motion picture industry. This book is, well, it's definitely getting up there now, but it's from the early 2000s. This is one of the best books about it's called different things, but the new Hollywood, or the Hollywood Renaissance of the late 60s, early 70s, and the generational shift and the collapse of the studio system. So this is Mark Harris's Pictures at a Revolution, from Penguin. It's a really great read, very, very detailed about this period. It tends to focus on the five movies he selects as a way to best explain this movement and generational shift. So it focuses on five titles in particular, but of course mentions other people and other films too. But uses five choices to kind of give you the best overall idea of what this movement meant, and why it was such a complete shame when it was just basically killed off. But anyway, a really, really great book. If you're looking to understand more about this time period, this is a great book to check out. It's not super long, and it's not too on the wordy side, so it's also one that you can pick up even if you don't know a whole lot about Hollywood history, but very recommended. This one is kind of in a similar vein. It's pretty well known now. This is actually the third edition, but this is Robert Kolker's Cinema of Loneliness, which primarily talks about certain works of the directors Arthur Penn, Oliver Stone, Stanley Kubrick, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, and Robert Altman. So again, focusing primarily on this new Hollywood period of the late 60s to early 70s. But he basically links these directors' works and finds that they always have this core of well, not really set of core values, but similar cores to them, similar feelings, that they're all about individuals who are either displaced or outcasts or somehow feel alienated from the rest of society, and how they deal with that particular sensation. So it's a really great, insightful read, even if you're not a fan of all of these directors and their works. And it's also one that's been used in a lot of college courses, either referenced or as part of the curriculum. So you can find a copy of this for super, super cheap. It's a great book to have on hand just to flip through every once in a while. Well, if you didn't have enough books about the New Hollywood period, here's another one. This one is not very well known, but I was given a copy of it years ago. It's not in the best shape, but it's actually a really, really well written book. So this is a book by Peter Lev. It's called American Films of the 70s. Subtitle is Conflicting Visions. Again, this is a book that takes a look at the New Hollywood period and uses specific films to bring up the author's points. What's really great is broken down to each chapter is about a particular type of film and or historical reference. There's a really, really great section about the films that deal with politics and governmental authoritarian mistrust, and then of course that also referencing Chinatown and how they use the form of the neo noir to adapt the conflicts of the 1970s, but through a period guise. So it also uses some examples and some films that are not really used as often, and they really should be. Like, for example, there's a really great piece in here on the masterpiece Night Moves, the Arthur Penn film from 1975. And it's films like that that are not referenced as much as some of the others that just get mentioned over and over and over again. Like, yeah, all these books are going to talk about Bonnie and Clyde 1,000 times. But it's really great when you get a book that also delves into less recognizable titles. So this is a really nice little book. If you see a copy for cheap, pick it up, flip through it, see what you think. So yeah, this was just given to me many years ago. It's got a tape spine, but it's still in readable shape. So this is a book I just recently picked up. I've heard of it, but I've never read it. This is originally, of course, a French book because it was written by Jean Mitry. It was translated by Christopher King, but again, heard of this. Saw a cheap copy, so of course I'm going to buy it. This is The Aesthetics and Psychology of the Cinema. Um, I think this is from, yeah, it's from Indiana, I think Indiana University Press, but this is a really interesting book. Of course, it's going to come from a certain viewpoint and was written, several decades ago. And of course, anytime you read a book and it's been translated, sometimes it depends on how good the translation is. But I'm excited to read through this and see what it's like. Again, I've heard it referenced before, but unfortunately, there's no stills or anything, so it's just straight up hardcore text. But anyway, this should be a fun read. This one is a book entirely on adventure films, but primarily, what came to be known as the Swashbuckler, which is, of course, why it has the title, The Swashbucklers. Again, this is also, of course, pre-internet era, so it's giving some synopsis of these films. But what is really nice is that they didn't just do that; they also give you tons of background material, and it's actually filled. It doesn't look like it's going to be, but it is filled with some really nice stills all the way throughout. And again, it's well printed. This is still in very good shape, so this is actually a good little read. It's actually not little. It's actually got a really nice page count. A lot of these usually would just be filled with synopsis parts, or the stills would take up most of it. But this is actually pretty hefty. So if you're interested in this type of film, as I very much am, this is a nice little book if you do find a copy in a used shop for cheap. So next up is a book. It's actually a lot of fun. I remember reading this a couple years ago, and it's nice and gossipy. But this is entitled "The Big Show: High Times and Dirty Dealings Backstage at the Academy Awards." So it's basically just a book about Oscar history and behind-the-scenes material, and about various snafus and interesting dealings, and then voting rights, etc. About the primarily the late '90s, early 2000s, and some little bits about earlier Oscar shows and things. So it's an interesting little book. This kind of stuff is really fascinating, and they don't usually let a lot of that get out because they just want it to be this perfect institution, which of course it is not. But anyway, It's an interesting little book, and I found this copy for literally dirt cheap, just a few cents. So it's a fun little read if you ever come across it. This is another one I picked up in a used shop. I haven't got a chance to read yet, but it looked interesting because unfortunately there's not a whole lot of written materials about film scores and motion picture composition. So this is called Film Music: A Neglected Art. It's the second edition by Roy Pendergrass. So I figured this would be an interesting read because I'm obsessed with film music, as most people are, but very few books are really out there about motion picture music composition. And of course, it's actually got not just pictures and diagrams, but actual music composition in here. So this is a really interesting book. So excited to finally actually sit down and read through this. This is another classic work of film criticism, film theory. Again, I'm sure this has been used in a lot of coursework, which is why it's got a university use sticker on it. But it's actually quite good, even though it's getting on up there in years. But anyway, this is entitled "A Certain Tendency of the Hollywood Cinema, 1930 to 1980," by Robert Ray. And of course, some really nice frame grabs, primarily from Bogart titles, but then of course, you have two there from Manderset Liberty Valance thrown in there. So, of course, you put Casablanca, Liberty Valance, and on the front cover. Of course, you've automatically piqued my interest. So anyway, this is a little dog-eared, but and definitely getting on up there in years. But it's actually well written. It's a good book, but of course, when you have a book with titles like formal and thematic paradigms and uh, dissolution of the homogenous audience. You kind of know what you're getting into. There are some good sections about the post war period of studio films. So you get the pre, during, and post war periods, which are all extremely important in understanding the studio system. So it's still a really nice read. Again, you can get it for dirt cheap. And this must have been at a college at some point because it's really dog eared, but it's still in good shape. This one I just picked up because the author is somebody who, if again, one of those names you see it, I'm probably going to read it. But anyway, this is Placing Movies: The Practice of Film Criticism by Jonathan Rosenbaum. So this is again, it's one of those things where it's kind of like a grab bag of a certain critic's work. So it does have some critical pieces from various magazines and things, but it's also got some really nice essays. They're broken up into about 4 or 5 sections. So Rosenbaum's another one of the really good writers. So I just had to pick this up. This is another that just passed through the used bookshop, and they have a habit of marking down reference books like this for insanely cheap prices. So when really great, normally expensive film books like this are like less than $1, I'm like, okay, I take it home. Um, this is another example of that. I've read a lot of this particular writer because who really hasn't in motion picture studies because he was one of the like leaders of the charge and became the great uh, leader of auteur criticism here in the U.S. But this is Andrew Sarris's book entitled "You Ain't Heard Nothing Yet: The American Talking Film History and Memory, 1927 to 1949." So this is essentially full on. I guess you could consider it almost textbook like. Uh, but then again, it's broken down by individuals. So you have entire chapters on Sternberg, John Ford, Hitchcock, Harold Lloyd, Griffith. But you also have chapters on various genres and types, from screwball comedy to noir and western and horror films. So it's again not exactly a textbook. It's again, I guess, to go back to the term of being a grab bag of various types of writing, but this book particularly focuses on film genres, key personnel, notable figures. So it's a nice overview, and Saris was one of the, more important names in film writing for many, many, many decades. So again, one of those names you kind of have to pick it up and read it if you're at all interested in this material. Um, so yeah, I know I've read this years and years ago because I remember flipping through this again. This was another find in the used bookshop for insanely dirt cheap. So yeah, I'm gonna reread this, but I remember reading this years and years ago because certain passages are very very familiar. This is another one. I swear I've read it years ago, but I'm going to reread it again. It was a find in the used bookshop. This is Thomas Schatz's "Genius of the System: Hollywood Filmmaking in the Studio Era." So this is a really nice overview again of studio policies, studio politics, and how the factory line assembly system of motion picture making actually worked. This is one of the few books that actually talks about the positives of all the pressures of the studio contract system and the assembly line production system. Because if you really look at it the way this book and other books do, you realize that limitations that the studio system put on people and even the production code itself actually inspire people to be even more creative because of the limitations. And again, like a lot of these books, there are some really nice stills in here to break up the constant text. So this is a pretty good read. I've read a chunk of it so far, but it's been on my to read shelf a long time. But I do remember reading this years and years ago at a library, and it is a really great read because it's again one of the few books that actually talks about some of this stuff actually having some positive effect. This is another one, just a complete blind buy, and I'm going to read it at some point. This is Movie Made America Cultural History of American Movies, the revised and updated edition by Robert Sklar. So, again, this kind of gets more into not just certain films and anecdotes and things, but also cultural history and the cultural impact on the country. So, again, anytime that you can find something that's a bit more, at least not the same thing you've read 100 times. It helps, and it's also broken up by really nice full page stills. So, and there's actually quite a number of stills in here. And again, this is an updated version, so I think the original one was written at least some time ago. Yes, 1975. So this is an updated version from the 90s. So you are. All right, next up are all my books by Roger Ebert, who, of course, has long, pretty much my whole life, been my favorite film writer. Of course, primarily known for the At the Movies review series on television with Gene Siskel and later various others. But I do feel like his writing is not given enough credit because, as great as those shows were, you can only fit so much wit and sparkle and intelligence into what's essentially tiny sound bites. Of course, I'm not the first to say this. He won the Pulitzer Prize for good reason, but I find his writing still to this day absolutely fascinating, even when you don't necessarily agree with it. So I've tried to collect, his various books on motion pictures and things. There are a couple that I'm still missing from the 70s, 80s, 90s, but I do have a good selection of them. This first one is from, I believe it's the late 70s, early 80s. Okay, yeah, mid 80s. But anyway, entitled A Kiss is Still a Kiss, of course, the lyric from As Time Goes By. But this is, again, one of these books that's kind of like a grab bag of individual pieces, remembrances, and things like that. And again, all in his just completely distinctive, wonderful writing voice. So, very highly recommended if you come across it. And again, one of these books that's kind of tough to find now. It's never been reprinted or anything, but various pieces that are in here are on his website or in other books and things. So. But he has a number. He had a number of these earlier books that are, just still kind of floating around in used bookshops. This is a compilation of an old column he had called the movie Answer Man. So these were where various individuals would write in asking various questions. Usually the questions, but especially the answers, would have a humorous slant. So this is questions for the movie Answer Man. So this is basically reprintings of this particular newspaper column that existed in the primarily in the 90s. But again, it's worth reading for all of his quirky, snarky, sometimes one word or one sentence answers, and for his various personal definition terms for movie cliches and dumb screenwriting, among many other things. So just a fun little snarky book. Again, some of this stuff is on his website because RogerEbert.com has a giant archive of his not just his reviews, but special pieces, interviews, and his old blog posts as well. So that's an invaluable resource if you've never checked it out. This is a fun little book you can usually pick up for cheap. This one is another compilation with a tiny little bit extra here and there, but this is basically a compilation of his notoriously bad reviews of terrible movies with a beautiful cover and title simply entitled "Your Movie Sucks." So the cover and title alone should tell you that this is a hugely entertaining read. Again, you can look at most of these reviews online now, but to actually have them collected with just a beautiful cover like this, because, we've all had this reaction coming out of particularly dumb things. So, yeah, this is just a great read if you've never read it. And it basically collects all the amazingly terrible reviews and all of the the raging in print, but beautifully done. This next one, this is just a giant grab bag. It's a really great tome of various pieces about, again, everything from notable figures, famous actors, actresses, to interview pieces, just all kinds of things. But it's entitled Ebert's Book of Film. I've always loved this cover with all of the various luminaries and the whole, cutout style, and then Roger stuck there in the front there, and on a really cheeky side, the rear actually identifies all of them, which I always liked. This was usually floating around bookstores when I was growing up, and I remember thumbing through it a lot. But it's really cool to finally get my own copy. Again, this is just a grab bag of just all kinds of different writing pieces, interviews, reflections, theorems, all kinds of stuff. Fantastic read. Very very highly recommended. Very easily available. And again, a lot of this stuff is on the web is on his website if you're really curious to check it out. But here I'd say this is where we come to the really important one. So in addition to the answer column, he started a column called The Great Movies, where he would write special pieces about particular timeless titles that he felt were truly among the important artworks of the medium. And then they started collecting them into book form every 100 or so, starting in the late 90s with the first volume shown here, simply entitled The Great Movies, with this distinctive, lovely black and white with gold tinted cover design. Um, and of course, all of these are available on the website, but it's really great to have them in book form. And I've always loved the design of these books, and each one has a extremely well chosen film still uh, with each entry. Here's the one for Artaud's Beauty and the Beast, for example. But anyway, even though, again, you may not necessarily agree with all his choices, again, the writing is so eloquent. And I think, particularly in this series, he really hit his stride. And because it wasn't just writing about new releases, it was also talking about art history and personal remembrances with these certain titles. So there was much more of a personal touch here. And this collection in particular, the first 100, I think, and maybe just because I've read this book so many times, this is not my first copy. I've read this book until it's fallen apart before. But this is not just great film writing, but I think it's one of the handful of truly great books on motion pictures. If you want to gain a greater appreciation of the medium, definitely check out this book, Volume One. The other volumes are also great, but this one in particular just really always grabbed me, and I've returned to it so many times, thumbed through it way too many times. And again, all of these particular reviews are on the Ebert website still, so you can read them if you want to. You don't have to actually get the published versions, but again, the covers and the stills are wonderful, and I love having this on the shelf to always pull off. So a couple years later, the second volume was released, and with starting with this volume, and then of course the next one, it was really always interesting to see what was going to be chosen and included. And sometimes they are completely unexpected or off the wall, and it's really amazing to see his reasoning. And he sometimes has to argue for argue for why they are destined as having greatness. But anyway, so same design as the first volume, just the next volume of entries. And then we have the third and unfortunately final volume, Great Movies 3, which collected the next 100 or so entries. And again, keeping in the same great cover design, just with a slight color change. So they all go well and they match on the shelf. But again, I think all of these are essential, but they are available for online reading. So you don't necessarily have to get the print versions if you don't want to. So next up is another collection book. This one is entitled Awake in the Dark, The Best of 40 Years of Reviews, Essays, and Interviews. So again, this, and fortunately this doesn't reprint, a whole lot from the book of film and other books. So it is important to have, both books. So this also reprints a lot of obscure old newspaper articles and things. And then there's great sections on underrated titles and personal remembrances and things. So just another key important work full of fantastic writing. And then lastly, you have to include this. It's just a wonderful book. Also, the subject of a wonderful documentary if you haven't seen it. But this is his memoir entitled Life Itself. Again, I really love the cover art. It's very simple, but very stylized. Has a sort of interesting embossing quality to the jacket. So a very great read, very great documentary as well if you haven't seen it. But I as great as the documentary is, I do prefer the book because of course you have more room for detail, and also hearing someone's life story in their own words, especially when they're such a great writer already, is just an irresistible opportunity. So very highly recommended if you haven't read it yet or seen the documentary. And just a really, really great book. And I was really happy that this all got released before his death, which was not too. It was shortly thereafter, after this book was published and the documentary was made. It was I think a little of like maybe a couple years or something like that. But it was not too not too far away, unfortunately. So just a really, really great remembrance in a lot of ways. And so, lastly, we come to just the handful of books that I currently own. I've owned others and read way, way, way too many. These are all on. These are all noir related, or on various elements of film noir as a genre, style, uh, historical element. Pretty much you name it. If it has noir on the cover somewhere, I'm going to read it. It's just I can't help it. So anyway, this is an interesting one. This is by Robin Buss, but it's actually all about French film noir titles. So this takes a specific look. It's primarily going to be French crime and detective thrillers of the pretty much the post-war period into the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and I think this was written in the early 2000s. So it kind of goes up to. 1994, republished 2001. Okay, yeah, so basically it goes up through the 90s era, but it's nice and interesting to actually cover, what is actually noir and how that looks through an international lens through one country's particular output. So this is a great little book if you do come across it, and it's a nice change of pace from the constant other books that are just primarily talking about the American films of the studio system of the 40s and 50s. This is one of the classic noir texts by Nicholas Christopher. This is one that is just a great read. It's always great to pull off the shelf and thumb through again, but this is Somewhere in the Night, Film Noir and the American City. Just a fantastic classic book of the understanding the noir genre and the style and its influences, and the legacy of noir as something much more than just simply a cliche that people think they can throw on. This one I picked up not too long ago. It's actually a really interesting book. I haven't got to read the whole thing yet, but it is the updated and expanded version of More Than Night: Film Noir in Its Context by James Nairmore, uh, which is actually a really nice, pretty hefty book with some nice stills in it. And of course, you have a it's kind of a blown up still. This is of course from Out of the Past, but I do love how it's kind of blown up, and so it's very grainy and very out of focus here on the book cover. I love the effect of that. I don't know if it's intentional, but just a lovely moment. But anyway, it's got some nice stills in here, but it's very hefty, and it's broken up into basically various subgenres of noir, and then examining how they all fit in the same genre, even though they are, ostensibly different. So you have sections on boxing films, crime films, detective films, and then explaining how they are all interrelated. And that ties into this next book, which is really the key tome. If you were to have one book on film noir, it's probably going to be this one. And this is a compilation, really, of various writers, but edited by Alain Silver and James Rossini. This is, of course, the classic film noir reader, which has gone through several volumes and updated versions and such. But again, this is really like just about one of the key tomes on noir. You can always pick this up and thumb through it again and come across something you'd forgotten about. Just a fantastic work, loaded with stills. And again, what's great about this is that each section is another piece by a different writer. So you get all these different viewpoints. Sometimes they'll reference some of the same titles. Usually they're talking about completely different ones, but it's really great if you read this all the way through and you get two different writers talking about the same films, but under, different ideas and notions and things. So reading this straight through instead of just reading individual sections really gives you a real variety of opinions, and then allows you to form your own. So I think it's really important to just read all the way through instead of just kind of cherry picking. A lot of courses will use this as a reference, or they'll reference certain sections from this or one of its later volumes, just in the way they will also very often reference Somewhere in the Night. There's a number of noir books, but these are two of the big ones. But this one in particular, Film Noir Reader, is referenced all the time. So very important book. You can get it for super super cheap. It is on the more critical side, so it may not be for everybody. But if you're at all into noir, you've probably already heard of this or have read an excerpt of something in it. So very highly recommended, very important, very, very well known and regarded. Well, that does it for my shelves of just film theory, film history, film criticism, and stuff. And this, of course, is just the books I currently own. I've picked up secondhand. I've read way too many in libraries and other places, or online articles and things. But hopefully this gave you an idea of maybe some books you want to check out, or books you've been meaning to read. All of these are available, rather cheaply in secondhand used bookshops or on eBay and other places. But I think it's interesting to just dig into things that just look interesting, even if you don't get a whole lot out of them. You always get more experience and usually learn at least some random factoid to get some new ideas out of a strange book, or even one you don't like that much. So, and I really think film books are undervalued and underrated in terms of not just academia, but nonfiction books in general. It's not a genre that's very popular or popularized, or it's usually the smallest section in a bookstore, or a even a used bookshop. It's usually a small little section mixed in with a bunch of biographies. So that's why I wanted to start this series with my books on history and criticism and such. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Thanks for checking this out, and hopefully it inspires you to check out some new books. Well, the books that are new to you at the very least. So thanks for watching, everybody.